policies and guidelines, and it's super complicated. So what I try to do in these sessions is give you some understanding if you're looking to be in a collective, whether it's a dispensary, a delivery service, whatever have you, try to give you some sense of what you need to be aware of so that you can make a choice as to whether or not you think you want to move forward from here on a commercial, quasi-commercial level, in which case it would probably be in your interest, and I think you'll get the message after today, to work with a lawyer, whether it's me or somebody that does what I do on the level that I do it. And I emphasize on the level that I do it. I'm not saying I'm the best. I wouldn't even say I'm the best. But there's a whole range of attorneys out there. It's like doctors, it's like artists. You know, just because you have a law degree or a license to do something, whether it's ride a motorcycle, be a cook, whatever, there's a whole range of people that have that same piece of paper. They don't necessarily have the skill set. And it's challenging to figure out from where you're sitting who you should hire as a lawyer. And I again emphasize, anybody who's going into this for more than just personal use, personal cultivation, you really need to have a lawyer. But it's hard to select a lawyer in this area because you're not lawyers. And even lawyers aren't always good at picking out lawyers in an area that they're not familiar with. It takes a little bit of work, takes some research. It's like picking out a doctor on your plan. You know, you have this list of network doctors and you don't know who to go to. So anyway, I emphasize to you, and I think it'll come through today, the importance of making good decisions. And the only way to make good decisions is to be well informed and have people around you who can help you be informed. So with that introduction, I'm going to start by just giving you a brief overview of what laws we have to deal with when we're talking about medical marijuana. And for better or for worse, the starting point is federal law. We have what's called it's a federalist system of government, which basically means for these purposes that we have a federal authority that is the central highest authority in the land. And we also have individual states that have their own laws. Sorry to put you to sleep already. The concept here is federal law reigns supreme pretty much everywhere in this country, including in your home, in your garden, in your car. You're still subject to federal law. So we'll talk more about, in a minute, about what state law allows you to do. Federal law doesn't allow you to do anything when it comes to marijuana. Federal law views the growth of one plant as a felony. So congratulations, everybody in here is likely a felon. The federal law would also treat, you know, obviously the sale of marijuana as a felony. Basically, anything to do with marijuana, including possession, is illegal under federal law. And, you know, I'm not going to dwell on it. I'll let, you know, if anyone has questions about it, we can talk specifically about some of the issues under federal law. But the real point is that you just need to be aware that even if you're, you know, whether you're working with a lawyer, whatever you're doing, whether you feel like you're compliant with state law, you just have to be aware of this other lurking beast out there that could potentially hurt you. And if you don't stay sort of on the course of state legality, it's my view that even though, you know, essentially the way the federal government is dealing with this right now is they're kind of not. Over the last few years, the federal government has taken a more lax, permissive attitude towards medical marijuana. And in fact, some of you may have heard of some of the letters that have been written by the Department of Justice over the last several years speaking to this issue of, is Bob in here? Yeah, would you get him? If you guys turn to the green pages, they deal with the legal issues that I'm going to talk about. The first thing in here is a letter from the Department of Justice in 2009 addressing the federal government's new policy on enforcement of the medical marijuana laws. So basically, prior to Obama being elected, under the prior administrations, there was somewhat of an aggressive policy about federal law enforcement trying to shut down dispensaries. The DEA would send out letters to dispensaries, close down, or actually they'd send them out to the dispensary landlords saying, if you don't shut this down, you could forfeit your property. Scare tactics. That was up to about 2007. So Obama kind of signaled during his campaign that he was going to take a different view towards medical marijuana, and he wasn't going to crack down on the compassionate use of marijuana. And the letter that you're looking at, October 19th, 2009, was from the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice, for those of you not in law enforcement or in government, is essentially the biggest cop in the land. The Department of Justice is the federal government's prosecutorial office. So Attorney General of the United States is the chief law enforcement officer in the land. Department of Justice comes under them. Department of Justice governs all of the United States attorney's offices around the country, which are responsible for enforcing federal law. So essentially, this is the chief federal law enforcement officer telling the attorney generals, the United States attorneys in the various states that had medical marijuana, essentially, and you can read this, you don't need me to read it to you, but it's essentially, let's not use our resources to go after patients and caregivers in medical marijuana. It says quite plainly, you know, if you're a drug dealer, if you're a money launderer, if you're engaging in violence, if you're engaging in sales to minors, those are the kinds of things that will identify you as a person that we want to shut down and go after. But it's basically signaling that they're just not going to use their sparse resources on going after medical marijuana collectives, etc. Although they don't use that language, that's the essence of this. After this letter came out, there was, of course, a wave of new collectives and dispensaries opening up now that they felt like they had a little bit more cover. Because, you know, some of you might not know this, some of you probably do. The federal laws are scary for cultivators because the federal laws, the way the sentencing guidelines work, in drug cases, your sentence is typically dictated by your criminal history, but also the amount of drugs you're dealing with and the type of drug you're dealing with. Marijuana is not that severe for sentencing relative to other drugs, even though marijuana is a controlled substance. Schedule I, heroin is the same, LSD is the same. But when you get to 100 plants, you're now in the deep end of the pool, because 100 plants is a minimum of 5 years in a federal hotel, essentially. Mandatory minimum, 5 years in prison. So some of you in this room may be thinking, oh shit, I better go home and destroy my plants, because I'm looking at 5 years. 1,000 plants is 10 years in prison. It's 100 plants or 100 kilos get you into the 5-year minimum. For those of you who don't know the metric system, and I have to constantly remind myself of this, it's 2.2 pounds to a kilo. So it's 220 pounds of flower bud. If you have 220 pounds of flower bud, you have other issues. But besides that, that was actually a joke. She got it. Anyway, got major problems. And please do call me. So the equivalent, they view the equivalent of 220 pounds, 100 plants, because of the way they treat plant for weight purposes. Before anybody goes crazy, though, the reality is that, you know, there are ways to manipulate that sentence down so it's more manageable, so it's not 5 years, so it's really more like 1 or 2 years. I know that's still pretty harsh, but look, anybody here who doesn't have who can't handle the risk of being arrested does not belong in this business. I mean, it's just, even when we talk about the state stuff, there's still risks of arrests. On the state side, there's not the same risk of prosecution, and there's not the same risk of going to jail. In fact, there's very little risk of going to jail. But on the federal side, there is a risk of going to prison, even if you are operating in complete compliance with the federal laws. There are ways, however, in my view, of minimizing those risks and getting out from under the 5-year mandatory minimum, and also perhaps even being eligible for probation. But the way to do that, in my judgment, is to be as compliant not only with the letter of the law on the state side, but the spirit of the law. Because the way the sentencing decisions are made, especially now, you have the ability to bring forward evidence. Even though you can't use, the medical marijuana laws are completely irrelevant in a federal prosecution. You can't go before a federal jury and show your compliance with the medical marijuana laws the way you can in a state prosecution. However, at sentencing, you can bring that out. And if you're legitimately a caregiver, or you're somebody really working in a nonprofit and doing all the right things, and you're not doing any other things that are bad, like stealing power, or you have guns, there are things that can be done for you to get you out from under a 5-year sentence. And the reality is, that just like this letter kind of signals, they're not focusing on the 100-plant growers like they used to. They don't have the resources, let alone the information. It's really, if they're going to kind of be interested in you, it's going to be because you're really super large, or you're just a pain in the ass in the neighborhood, and we'll talk about how to avoid being a pain in the ass in the neighborhood. But the federal stuff is still out there. It'll probably remain out there, at least until they reschedule marijuana from a Schedule 1. God knows when that's going to happen. That's federal law. Any questions on federal law? No questions? Cool. So let's talk about state law. I mean, again, the way to avoid the federal stuff, I'll talk about one other way later, but the main way to avoid the federal stuff is just be really careful about who you're dealing with, because the likelihood is that no one in here is going to be, even if you're growing 100 plants or 200 plants or 300 plants, no one in here is going to trigger a federal investigation unless you're doing it in an area that the feds are otherwise looking at. You're doing it in an area that's gang infested. You're dealing with somebody at a dispensary who you don't know happens to be under federal investigation for something else. That's typically how you get ensnared in a federal net. That's your worry on the federal side, more than just the fact that you have 100 plants or 200 plants or 300 plants, or 400 or 500 even.